Okay, so there's one more step we need to do to make sure we don't lose our sanity in this process. And that is we have these three hair material tags that are not named. And so we need to make sure we name them so it's easier to know which one we're clicking on. We don't have to go back and forth. So I have ponytail selected, right? And this is highlighted in orange because it's the active tag. So if I double click on the name, I can just type in ponytail. Right, if I go to half hawk, that's the next one here. I'm going to type in half hawk. And then I'm going to go to this one, and I'm going to go ahead and say that's probably short hair. Yep. So I'm just going to call it short for now. Okay, so I've got those three set. With all of these, let's go ahead and render this real quick and see what we've got thus far. So if I go to my render view and hit render, you're going to see that we've got some really awful looking hair going on, right? It does not look good in any way, shape, or form, right? There's some issues with, right, rendering color. There's a lot of problems with this. So let's go ahead and first we're going to put a light or two in the scene. We could, it might make sense to go ahead and just do a dome light. So let's go ahead and go down here. We're going to say dome light. And then right in the texture tab there, we can open up our, we can bring an HDRI out from our asset browser. So just asset browser HDRI. And then in the image media, we can grab any of these and just drag it into that texture field. I'm going to grab one of these brighter ones and just drop it in there. It's going to take it a second. It might take it a little longer if it needs to. Okay, right, so now we at least have better light. You can see it still doesn't necessarily look good in any way, shape, or form. So the other thing we want to do then is we're going to need to create a principled hair material. Now with the principled hair material, we're going to apply it the same one to all three of these for the time being. We may in the future want to change that, but we really just want to simplify the number of changes we have to make when we make a change across the entire thing. So we're going to apply this to all three of these. And then let's double click our principled hair. And let's go ahead and adjust a couple things. First, really we're going to override the albedo of the principled hair, and we're going to override the diffuse contribution. So we're going to crank this to 100%, and we're going to crank this to 100%. And once we do that, we'll get whatever the hair color is for these hair objects without interference from the other one. And that's just, we're just doing that to make our life a little bit easier as we go forward. So I want you to note, right, our hair looks pretty awful right now. This is where our hair material tags or hair materials come in. So I'm going to start with the half hawk. And one of the things that instantly makes this look better is one, we need to adjust our thickness. So if I select the thickness here, right, this head is not that big, right? So 1 centimeter thick hair is pretty intense. Now, if you're doing something more in like a cartoon style or whatever, you might want thicker hair. But in our case, let's go ahead and set this to 0.01 at the base and 0.001 for the tip. Right, so already that you can see, we can actually see through the hair now in this instead of it being this thick block of nothing. And then let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit so we can actually see a little bit more of this hair and have it render a little bit better maybe. Okay, so now the other issue is that it still looks like it's like ghosting this volume. And so another setting that really helps is taking the length, changing the length to, if we set it to like 70% with a 20% variation, you can see that made a pretty huge impact in the actual like length, but it's also kind of broken up those chunks. Now there are still some heavy areas here, and that's just because in the default state, that's what it's going to look like for now. I'm going to set my variation to 10%. right? So it's a little bit closer, and then I might make the length like 90%, right? So we've got 90%, so it should be able to go out to 100, but it'll dip down to 90 as well. And we could basically, I wish we could capture all of that here in one go, but unfortunately we cannot do that. So we're going to go ahead and do this for our other ones as well. So let's go to our short, and we're already in the length tab. Let's go ahead and check mark it, turn it on, right? And just set this to 90 and set this to 10. Okay, so that should help with the short hair, which we're not going to really be able to see. And honestly, the short hair maybe is the one we don't necessarily need to manipulate. We're going to set this length to 90%, set variation to 10, check mark length, and that should go. Okay. Now the other thing is, right, we haven't modified the thickness at all, but you can actually see with this thicker hair, you can actually see that variation on the edge there pretty clearly. And so let's go ahead and adjust the thickness of our hair here. And we're going to say 0.01. And just honestly, to make it a little bit nicer for the render and the speed, let's just set it even. So it doesn't shrink. It just goes 0.01 on both of these. And that should thin it out a little bit. Yeah, we get a bit more, something that looks more like hair than chunks. And let's do the same with the short. Let's just set this to 0.01 and set this to 0.01. And then we'll do the ponytail, or the half hawk as well. Let's just delete one of those zeros in our tip. And we should have something that's a little bit heavier and thicker, kind of shows that hair a little bit better. Okay. And let's rotate and let's see the short hair on the side here. And then we're going to get ready to start manipulating this a little bit. Oh, the short side is completely in shadow from the half hawk. Okay, that's hilarious. All right, so let's go ahead and look at some styling things. We're going to go ahead and close our Redshift render view. We don't need that open for this. And we're going to close our material editor for the time being. Let's go ahead and get our head kind of centered in our viewport. And we're going to change from the standard layout, we're going to go over to Groom, because Groom is specifically intended to allow us to groom hair, right? And because we're working with these different chunks, let's go ahead and we're going to turn off everything we're not working on. It'll make things go a little faster and it'll make it less confusing. So I'm going to turn the short hair off. I'm going to turn the half hawk off. So all I can see is my ponytail. So I've got this selected, right? And we know that if we hit play, right, we can get our hair to fall in whichever direction we want. If we step forward one frame at a time, we can have a lot more control of where we stop this fall, right? Like if I'm happy with the hair like here at the base, and I know I just want to adjust the ends at this point, then I can stop this here. Okay, so let's look at how we can adjust this and what all these tools are over here. So currently we are in guides mode, right? And there are different tools. One of the basic tools we use is the brush, right? And you can see when I turn the brush on, it's actually going to pop it back to where it was before. My hair is not going to update. And so maybe we'll do this without dealing with doing some setting things and all of that right now. Let's just go ahead and start from here. So if I have the move tool and I'm in guides mode, right, it's going to manipulate the guides wherever I push. And they're all going to be manipulated. It's like every segment on here is going to be manipulated, right? And so you can see that, right, it's doing things. I have a fair amount of control, but it's not perfect. And you know, there's times like you can kind of see like I'd like these tips to dip in maybe. There's a lot of things I'd like to do that I'm unfortunately not able to do by default. You can play with this and have fun if you'd like. Comb is not going to work for us right now. There are a bunch of other tools down here, right? We can actually cut the hair, so we can actually trim some of these guides shorter than others. We can curl it. We can push it around, and I can't remember if push works well with this mode. No, it does not. And we can also straighten hair, right? And in this mode, I don't think, yeah, straighten does work, right? And what it's doing is this, it straightens the hair in the entire tag, right? Or whatever we have selected. But let's look at how we can have a bit more control. Okay, so if we go to our brush, but we go to one of these other modes. There's vertices modes, points mode, roots mode, and tips mode. Let's go to tips mode. Now with tips mode, what I can do is I can independently basically just move the tip, right, of this hair, right? I can scrunch it in, pull it out, right? You can see that I have some control, but it's not great. If my brush is big enough, I can grab multiple things and manipulate them together, multiple guides. It really, really depends on, right, what we want to do. If I go to roots mode, right, I can, in this case, right, there's nothing I can do with this tool. It's not going to move the roots around for me, right? It's not, that's not going to function. Now, if I want to, if I go back to tips mode, I can also use this selection tool here. This is my brush selection tool, and I can actually select an independent point. And if I want to use move tools and things, I can actually click and drag and move this around with that tool. You'll notice the axis doesn't really show up for that, but I can go in my different views and isolate that. I can rotate this point, which you can see how that rotation works, right? It's rotating in, right? It's rotating in a really strange direction. But you can see that like I can rotate that point. Scale in this case, right, is going to make this path either shorter or longer, right? You can think about all of these things are in reference or in relation to the whole of the guide, right? So I can make parts of this longer or shorter that way, right? There's, you know, I have many different options there. If I go to vertices mode, right, so I can select, right, independent points and actually manipulate these, right? I could say, oh, with these 4 right here at the end, maybe I want this to, maybe I want to actually, you know, rotate those 4 points, right? So this aims out a little bit. All right, so it's rotating and spreading in that direction. You can kind of see, right, how that could be useful. There are some other hair tools that are not just immediately available, right, through this interface. If I go up to simulate and I go down to hair edit or hair selection, right, hair tools, you can see there's a lot of things in here. So, if I go, hair tools is what is mostly available up there. If I go to hair selection and if I hover over this top little bar here and click, it's going to pop this out. And with this hair selection, what I can do is if I have, say, one vertice selected, let me just select one here, you can go to next and previous vertex, right? So I can actually, oh, I don't know why, oh, okay, so I've got a vertex selected there. Let's see here. So if I go to next vertex, there we go. So in this mode, I can isolate this and just select one vertice at a time. I can also, I think if I hold down Shift and select, if I hit Command All, right, you can't really see it through all the hair, but I've got every one of those selected. And then I can go, and this is where I can, if I wanted to say, maybe I wanted the ponytail to tighten in here. Now I should be able to use the scale and click in, oh, no, and that's still going to pull it all that way. Right, so scale doesn't do what I want it to do, right? I'd like to have these all scrunched together. That's where this clump tool comes in. If I click on this and I click and drag, you can see it spreads it out, or it's going to clump it all together. Now you'll note it is doing it uniformly and to the ends of this spline, and I can get to a certain point of clumpiness, and then I think I'm at the edge of my screen, or maybe you can just only go to 100%. Nope, you can keep going, right? So this is one of the tools that can really help with, right, sculpting things specifically like ponytails or other things like that. Okay, so I've got my ponytail clumped together. I've brushed it some. You can do whatever you want with this, right? This is your ponytail. Now, if I have my ponytail selected, and if I go ahead and hit play at this point, right, that ponytail is still going to drop and it's going to lose all of its volume, right? It's not going to be stuck out necessarily the way that I would like it to be pushed out from the head, right? Now, what I may want to do in this case is I might want to, do more brushing if I wanted it to be a little lower. But let's say I want this to just stand out, right, in this clump. There's a couple things you can do. And if you want it to be basically rigid, the way you do that is you go to your Dynamics tab and you check mark rigid. And as soon as I've check marked rigid, now what happens is, right, it'll fall a little bit, but it'll hold its shape. Let's stop the playhead. I'm going to go to standard mode so I can see, so I can actually select this model mode. And if I go ahead and hit play and use my move tool, you can see, like, if I was to animate this character, right, and he's running, the hair is moving, right, and jiggling around as he bounces, right? And so this allows you to have a certain amount of springiness to your hair, which is awesome if you're doing this, right? So let's say that we're happy with our ponytail. It's exactly what we'd like it to be. We're in a good spot. Let's go ahead and look at our half hawk. So we're going to go ahead and go back to our groom mode, and we are going to select our half hawk. We're going to make that visible. We could leave our ponytail visible, or we could turn it off. It doesn't really matter. And in this case, let's go ahead and attempt to comb our hair. So I'm going to go ahead and use the brush. And you can see there's a whole bunch of settings here in terms of the radius, the pressure. It's basically similar to lots of other hair or lots of other tools in Cinema. Note that there is this collisions option here, which would allow us to make sure it doesn't collide with the skin, sort of, when we do this. So if I check mark that and I go to a different mode than the one I'm currently in, let's go ahead and just go to guides mode, which is the default, right? And I might want my brush bigger as well. If I hit the opening or the closing bracket key, or the opening bracket key makes it smaller, closing bracket makes it bigger. I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bigger, and I'm going to I want this hair to fall this direction, right? And so let's see what happens when I do this. Now you'll see, right, already I've got some problems, right? I've got one guide that's not where it's at, and these other guides, that's going to be a nightmare, right? That hair looks really terrifying as it goes through his scalp. So this is something where I could probably use this tool and actually just bulk this up a little bit. But this is also a place where maybe I'm happy with, where it's hanging down everywhere else. But I may want to just manipulate the points right here at the edge so it has a little bit more volume. So in this case, we could go to vertex mode. We could select all. And then we can go back, and I closed that window, of course. But we can go back to our hair selection, pop this open, and we can go through and we can just say next vertex, right? And now that I'm at this vertex, let's go ahead and just manipulate those. And you'll see that, right, it basically locks the other ones in place. And so I can lift these up a little bit without, and I could actually crank these up a lot more if I wanted to. You'll see it does drag them along a little bit, but it's not quite the same. Now I'm going to go to ends mode, and I'm just going to select, right, this one end that went crazy. And I could probably just use my move tool, grab this thing and just start to pull it down so it matches the rest of the hair a little bit. Now, what I may want to do is I may actually want this hair, right, to curl a little bit in front of his face. Right, now it's sticking out much too far. All of these ends are in the front. So I could use my brush tool to push these all closer to, right, the surface of his head. So I can grab these and I can just kind of pull all of these ends in. And so with this, you can start to see the way that we can, right, we can start to sculpt this hair or style this hair in order to get what we want out of it in a way that isn't totally nightmarish to do. Now, in this case, right, this is really far forward, but you're going to see, right, in this mode, that point is staying there. So what I want to do is now I'm going to switch back to guides mode, and I'm actually going to pull the whole guide down a little bit and pull it in, right, and just get some of this a little bit closer to his face. All right, and maybe I can come this direction, see if I can just tuck all of this in a little bit this way. All right, so, all right, this is a way that we can, right, style some hair. And again, if we get to a place where we're like, we are happy with how this looks, we can do that. But let's look at some other tools before we go. Before we move on. So let's use our cut tool. And if I cut an entire guide, right, what it does is it just truncates the end off of that, right? So if I wanted his hair length to taper as it goes back to the back of his head, right? So it's a little bit, I can go ahead and just start. And basically what it does is each time I click, it's going to remove the segments beyond that, right? Like that was a bit too much. I want some hair hanging over his ear, like that. There we go. And you can see if I'm not careful, right, and select the wrong one, I'm going to get some issues. Now I can add guides and everything as well if needed. We're not going to get into that now, but it's pretty simple. You can just sort of plop a guide on there and go. Okay. Let's go ahead and save this. All right, and let's go ahead and turn our ponytail back on and our short hair back on as well. Now the short hair is still a little bit too long, you know, if we're doing something that's shaved, and because it's all supposed to be somewhat uniform, let's go ahead and select the short hair here, go to our guides, and let's set our length to 1 centimeter. Okay, that's a little bit closer to like to a shaved head. Now, the other issue is, you know, some people's hair sticks straight out. My hair is different. It's very curly, and so some of it is smeared against the skin, right? So again, this is some place where we could brush, but as soon as I start brushing, we just have to be very careful, right? It does not take much for the hair to start folding into the skin. Right, so I'm just going to do a slight brushing here, basically so it's not just sticking straight up. Okay, this is probably going to look hideous, but let's go ahead and see what he looks like when we render this. And we may want to add an additional light to the scene. Oops, I did not mean to go into, I do not want to do that. What I wanted to do was go to render view and render this. And let's see what we get. Now the issue is that I still have picture viewer going. Let's go ahead and say, yes, I do want to stop it. And then let's stop this one as well. Yes. Okay, let's close that. Now we should have enough resources to actually do this. Okay, so our lighting is terrible. Let's go ahead and add an area light. And let's zoom out a little bit and figure out where our area light is at. It's right, it looks like it's halfway through his body. So let's use the move tool. Let's pull this up. Let's lift this up a little bit. Rotate it down just a touch. And it's still like really bright, right? This light is intense. So I'm just going to pull it back a little bit further. That's a little better. Let's go ahead and zoom in on the head, and we'll just see what we get for the hair there. Right, so you can see that I've got the hair there, but we've got these really hard edges. And we've got, oh, that's a beautiful cut he's got going on there, right? So we've got some really hard edges with this. So how are we going to resolve some of these edges? There's a couple of things we can do. I'm going to go ahead and stop this. But you can see he does have a nice dense head of hair. The roots look all right. You know, given that he is, he looks like an unfinished human, right? What we need to do is we need to adjust the density of the hair, right? We can basically say, and we can actually use an image or a texture file to say we want more hair here and we want less hair here. And that's how we can get some of these, we could get a smoother edge here, or some variation or things depending on what we want to do, or if this person had like patchy hair or a patchy beard or something like that, we could work with that. So let's go ahead and I'm going to show you where you make that change, and we're just going to use like a gradient as an example. But then ideally what you would do is you would do the steps like UV unwrapping, or you'd take these UVs, you'd go into body paint, you'd create a texture file that's black and white, and then you could do grayscale to basically, or do a hard black and white shape, but you'd want to be painting on here to create that density mask, and then you would apply that to this material. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop open this material tag if it's not open, double click here, and we want to go down to density. And it's not here, let me clear this, it's not there by default. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and check mark this. Now, the first thing is I could set just the density by itself across the whole thing to whatever I want. So if I set it to 10%, I should have very, very few hairs on his head. Right? You can kind of see that's uniformly applied. I'm going to go back up to 100%. If I go to this texture, I can use a gradient, I can use noise, I could use Fresnel, which would be kind of funny, right? But I can use all sorts of different shaders to add some variation to this. In my case, I'm just going to use a gradient so we can kind of see simply what's happening. If I click on this, you'll see that, right, you can see that it's thinning here. And if I was to go ahead and rotate my view just a touch, right, you can kind of see that, right, it thins out and it gets a little bit thicker back here. If I click on my gradient and I was to pull this way down like this, I should be getting a lot more thickness, I think. Yeah, right. So now I've increased that density across most of the image. I could pull this back out, I could pull this up, and we could find where this edge is, where the density map is changing, right? So now there's nothing, right? Because the way that this image is laid out, the way my UVs are mapping on top of this, right, is going to be determining where things are at. So you can see now I'm getting some more density in the front, right? But it's totally gone in the back. If I was to pull this edge hard here, you can see that that is going to create a very firm edge here on my texture map, right? So if I wanted to thin the edge here, or right, you can imagine if I was using something else, I could get a very different appearance here. Let's go ahead and instead of using a gradient, let's just do noise. And if I just do general noise, right, it's just going to make, right, the density varied. But if I was to crank my contrast up, I should have some thick patches, there we go, and some thin patches. And you can see that at the scale that this is currently at, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we can see this. Oh, that is gorgeous. Right, but you can see that now I've got these islands of hair. And you can imagine, right, if you were painting, right, black where you didn't want hair and white where you wanted hair, and maybe a little bit you know, maybe there's areas where the hair is thinning or whatever. Um, this would be a way to do that, right? So these are all different ways you can control where hair is, how dense it is, etc. Combined with things that we did last time, right, where maybe we added some frizz or kink to it, we can start to get some, you know, realistic looking hair, and we have a ton of control over what's happening. So let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit here and rotate our view. This is where, oops, this is where I want this tutorial to end for the day. Remember, if you're happy with like the position of the hair or whatever, you can always lock it in. Here, things are kind of folding in on themselves a bit. I probably need to do a little bit more work to make sure that things are aligned the way I want them to. The only last thing that I want to note is you can also just select an edge. Like let's say I wanted to give this guy some eyelashes, right? This is the very last thing that we need to do. I'm going to close this. Okay, so Cinema just crashed on me while I was trying to do this eyelash section. So let's go ahead and add one set of eyelashes. Now, you're going to need to change your view to standard because something to note, when you're in groom mode and you're using the brush selection tool, even though it doesn't tell you it's anything about hair, this is only the brush selection tool for hairs, right? It will not select, even if I choose edges mode here, it's not going to select any sort of, any sort of edges or anything there. I can't select my mesh at all. So I need to go to standard mode. I could go to model mode as well. In edges mode, and you'll note, right, this tool isn't selected right now, right? So I need to click on it, then I can select it. And now if I select my bust, I should be able to select these edges. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and use not my brush selection tool, but I'm actually going to use my path selection tool. And I don't care where these eyelashes go, but I'm just going to go ahead and select an edge, right? Because I don't want hairs to be inside this polygon, right? I just need a thin, like essentially a line of hairs. I don't need a ton of hairs coming out in all directions, right? Now, if I was doing an eyebrow, right, I might want to be able to map that a little bit differently. But in this case for eyelashes, we need just an edge of hairs. And so I've got that selected. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to hold down Shift and C. I'm going to type in hair. And I could even type in add hair. And I don't know why this is taking so long to load, but it is. If I scroll down far enough, it thinks chair is a better option, right? But here's add hair. I could probably type in add and get it. So now you'll see I have guides coming out of my eyelashes that are really, really long. So let's go ahead and change this length to 3 centimeters. We're also going to change a couple other things. We're going to set our hairs, our number of hairs. We don't need 5,000 or 50,000 hairs for an eyelash, right? Let's go down to 5,000 instead for now. Should be a lot less intense. And then now if everything was working right, it would render. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go to render view. I'm going to go ahead and turn off all the other hairs that I'm using to make this lighter because it did just crash on me. I'm going to save my work so that we don't have this happen to you. You should save it as well. I am going to go ahead and start this now. And it says some types aren't being tracked. That's fine. Let's see if we get any hairs on our eye. Okay, it's really bright. I see no hairs whatsoever. So the first thing I'm going to do is this area light is probably too intense. I'm going to drop my exposure. There we go. That's going to make life a lot nicer for us. And then, right, I'm not getting any hairs rendering in my scene. So how do I resolve this? The big issue here, and I'm going to stop this. I'm trying to do all the things I can to make sure it doesn't crash on me again, is I need to select my hair that I'm going to use for my eyelashes, excuse me. I'm going to need to go to guides. And right now, the root is set to the polygon vertex. What I need to do is I need to change this to polygon edge. And granted, vertices are the corners of edges. But if I switch this to edge and I wait for a second, save it, and then go ahead and render this, it's going to take it a little bit of time, but there we go, right? So now we've got our, right, our hairs along this edge. Now that's a really thick eyelash and it's kind of not, perfectly smooth or anything like that, right? We've got some work to do on it, but we do have an eyelash there. Now we could, with our hair material, adjust the density that way. That might be the way we want to do it. Or we could come to hairs and we could just say, oh, let's try 200. Let's see if that thins things out. It does. Now, the other issue is, right, with our hair, we do need to use our hair material because right now, right, those hairs are really, really thick. And so we want to change our thickness. Let's set this to 0.01 and 0.01. And now, right, we're starting to get more eyelashy looking hairs. Obviously, they aren't quite exactly how we want them to be. Maybe curl would help. Oh yeah, maybe not. You can see the angle. There's some things here, and the direction is hair. It should be world, and let's try this in the Y direction. Right, so now you can see, right, I've got these curled up. We could also set this in the model, or which is local, which is probably going to be a similar result, but it won't. But it would change with, like, if the head rotates, right, the eyelashes are going to stay the same. And the axis is Z. We could try texture, but that would be, right, we'd have to apply that. We'd have to have a texture there. Let's try Y, right? That's not going to work for us. It looks like Z is probably our best bet. Yeah, X, unless we want those lashes tipping down. Y is probably our, Z is probably our best bet. Now, that's the fast way to do it, right? We could also go in and use the tools that we just learned in order to curl and shape those eyelashes. So let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit. And we've got incredible eyelashes. Let's go ahead and close this window and let's turn on our other hair objects and just see what we get for the final image here. Zoom out. Now, it did crash after I did the density stuff, so that's the reason why he doesn't have patchy hair on this side of his head. Again, right, we didn't even really manipulate any of these other tools or any of these other hairs. So if I was to say go to the half hawk, and if I added some frizz to this, that's going to make that hair look a lot more natural. If I added a little bit of curl to it as well, that might be too much. Yeah, it's going to look really silly. Maybe if I make it just a little bit wavy, we'll get a little bit more in there. You can see that helps some too. And again, right, you can adjust and play and really get the hair looking the way that you want it to look. Okay, that's all I've got for this tutorial. Yeah, it finally worked.